Bonsoir à tous et à toutes.
Good evening to all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having watched this screening, and thank you if you're staying on to deal with this topic. What should be done about artificial intelligence? We saw in this film all the issues that have arisen for the last few years, in fact, over the last decade or so, with the social media and their algorithms, the development of AI and generative AI that we talk about a lot, but not only, are creating new issues and risks, and we're going to have to work through those. So, to talk about this evening, we have three panelists. Estelle Pannatier,
qui est donc
who is head of policy and advocacy at AlgorithmWatch, an NGO based in Berlin and Zurich, works on algorithms and AI and wants respectful versions of both that respect human rights. This will lead us to a very complex and interesting debate. Then we have Giada Pistilli. She is a doctor in philosophy. Her thesis is entitled For Ethics of Conversational AI. We see that we're right in the very heart of the topic, and she is head of ethics in the French startup Hugging Face. It's an open source AI platform. And lastly, and we're working in alphabetical order here, Clémentine Pouzet. She's a doctoral student and specialist working on a thesis on AI and human rights. This is a topic that we've spoken about at length lately, and we'll be back on the same topic with the adoption of the AI Act. Maybe a reaction from each of the three of you on this documentary. Who would like to start? Estelle? Well, it's the second time I've seen this film, but it's been intense both times. What strikes me is the issue of these firms that are behind and that accept negative consequences in relation to fundamental rights, human rights, and also democracy, and why? To maximize their profits. And you see this both with the social media platforms and other providers of AI. Giada? Yes, it's quite striking. I was speaking to my co-panelists earlier on, and I said that I also do content moderation, and it's a very difficult job, especially when you're constantly faced with that type of content. One sort of on the spur of the moment reaction is something that was shown briefly, but that requires our attention. It's the fact that hatred requires user engagement on behalf of us all, of the users. When we're, for example, satisfied with a service, we tend to not say anything, whereas we're a lot more vocal when things don't go right. And it's exactly the same thing on the social media. So being aware of that is really important. Clémentine? Yes, I think this documentary also shows how AI can enhance biases and attacks on democracy and fundamental rights, and it shows that a framework is required. In my introduction, I said that in the documentary there are things that have been documented over the years, the amplifying effect of the algorithms on the economy of attention and what Giada was just talking about, i.e. the fact that the most aggressive content is what creates the most reaction, and the whole economy of the platforms has been built on this, and things aren't improving as of late. So what specific new risks are created by the latest developments of AI. We speak a lot about generative AI. We have AI that creates images and sound and writing. So what new problems arise with this? I think there are two fundamental questions. The first is that given that the internet consists in social media, and social media consists in part in hate speech, then the models are based on this. There's all the cleaning that goes on, and there are those who say that there are solutions, but it's not that simple.
Et donc, évidemment, comme ça reste aussi des systèmes de...
It's a significant part of the internet, and they are systems that are based on statistics and probability, so that it's very likely that the same content and patterns are reproduced. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that no AI is interesting without the internet paradigm, and the internet paradigm includes social media, so everything you share can be amplified too and enhanced. And that was mentioned in the film. Social media is a catalyst, and so AI is a catalyst time two, I would say. In addition, as a bonus, there's all the content that's generated, and that's going to also amplify this entire narrative. Estelle, in your NGO, in your daily work, what do you see emerging as problems, as issues, both new ones and worsening of existing ones, and everything related to, well, back then it was all on Facebook, but everything in relation to the American presidency and Myanmar, that was back then. Is this a second stage, a second step? Are things accelerating? Well, I think there's a lot to be said. We carry out research, be it research projects or journalistic inquiries, and we see that we have generative AI, social media, the generation with AI of images and others, and the use of algorithms that are used in all kinds of elements that have an impact on our daily life, job searches, social services, police services, etc. And we're in systems that are going to work on the basis of statistics and are going to reproduce the inequalities and imbalances of power that exist in society and therefore produce discrimination. And this is going to have an impact that goes well beyond just fundamental rights. It also affects democracy. And we have an example, which is the issue of deep fakes in relation to generative AI and the fact that you can very easily produce false content and false real images or real false images of people. And we realize that there's this problem of the interface between social networks and these generative platforms, which is a problem. If you make a deep fake of someone, you show it to your neighbor, well, nothing much will happen there, but it's once you start using these huge broadcasting boxes that are the social media that the issues are going to start arising. Clémentine, the discussion on the AI Act, the regulation of artificial intelligence that was adopted by the EU, this has also been affected by this, by the emergence, or not so much the emergence, but the distribution to the general public of AI. Has that changed the discussion, the narrative? Because all of a sudden these tools were made available to each and every one of us? Yes. At the beginning of the discussions on the AI Act, generative AI was not really taken into account. It was when ChatGPT was made available that the Parliament really started discussing that, and generative AI was included in the discussion, in the debate, and therefore in the AI Act.
C'est que du coup, c'est un régime juridique
And this created a very specific legal regime for the generative AI. And I must say that it has therefore had a huge impact on the act itself. Now we'll come back to legislation and how it evolves when there is such technological progress. But before that, Giada Pistilli, in the system of AI creation, to what extent do these systemic risks and risks for human rights and the democracy, to what extent are they taken into account? And since Trump came into power again, can this change the situation? Regarding social media, we saw this. We saw that over years there were improvements in terms of moderation, in terms of detection of influence campaigns or work on hate speech and on including the users in the loop. And then we saw that as soon as the American administration changed, the heads of these networks said, well, we've been moderating far too much, now we're going to backtrack. So in terms of AI, is there the risk that we may see this same kind of development?
And that's a complex question. I'll try to answer every aspect of it. So first of all, I can't speak for all tech companies because Hugging Face has a very specific place in that ecosystem. We develop our own tools, but we are a platform that hosts tools. So we look at that from a certain distance. So to answer your question, what has been the influence? Well, I think there's been a new wave of change on how social network information has been dealt with. And I'm sure Clémentine will have a lot to say about this. But in Europe, our position is quite fragilized because of this race to AI between the US and China. On the one hand, the US government has such an influence over big tech because everything that we consume here is made by American big tech, US big tech. And it's quite worrying. They are focused on coming up with general AI, the most powerful AI in the world, the AI that's able to do everything. And then there's China that's also racing to develop their own AI, and we're between a rock and a hard place. And we're feeling consequences of all this. You mentioned the steps back. Well, it's true that for a long time, we did a lot of moderation, steps forward on how we conduct moderation. But as the film showed, there's never enough content moderation. And the issue is that it's very difficult to anticipate. We mostly react to hate speech. AI, for the moment, is the Wild West. Every day there are new tools, new things. It's a booming sector. And it's true that we've backpedaled on moderation. And there's also a new discourse coming from the US that invites to reducing moderation and regulation. So from an ethical standpoint, that's quite dangerous because we're telling all users, all platforms, but also AI users that you're responsible for your own content. You're responsible for the content that you're producing, especially if it goes wrong. That's quite paradoxical because on the one hand, they tell you, well, it's the Far West, and it's you have to fend for yourself. There's Grok, developed by X. It's supposed to be an anti-woke AI. Then there's OpenAI with ChatGPT. That's moving strides in terms of security and then backpedals the Chinese competitors that produces content that tends to be censored quite often. So it's the Wild West, but there's a lot happening. And when I say that we're stuck in the middle in Europe, well, we're not very active in this whole discussion. Estelle Pannatier, is it a cause for concern that the US administration is saying that discrimination is not an issue anymore? We've even read articles about this. There are banned words from databases. So on the one hand, they say fundamental rights are right, but we can't regulate because it's limiting us. The Biden administration used to be a lot more open, weren't they? Absolutely, yes. The atmosphere is very, very tense. There is this push for deregulation. We've heard VP Vance in his speech, who was pressuring the EU to deregulate. Maybe we should say that the EU was also a pioneer in AI regulation with the AI Act, but also with the platform regulation through the Digital Service Act. And we're in Switzerland, so in Switzerland we don't have such regulations at all. In terms of AI regulation, we are at the very beginning of the process. The Federal Council a few weeks ago issued a decision on how they intend to regulate AI, but there's no law. Then there's also a law on platforms that's dragging its feet. So that also raises questions on where pressures on the Swiss government come from in this context. Clémentine Pouzet, AI Act. The AI Act was a pioneering law text. Does it embody the way the EU wants to set rules? When we see the Paris summit on AI, there were so many people saying that we need to tone it down with regulations and moderation because it will limit us in this rate, which is now dominated by the US and China. So will that fragilize the current European legal framework? And another question, what could the EU do legally to enforce its standards on US actors? Because very often they are trying to find ways to go around it. And we've seen it with the DSA. The DSA is violated regularly, especially by X and does not respect that law at all. So what could be done legally faced with such powerful players? Thank you very much. Well, that's a very rich question. So what you were saying earlier about not limiting innovation, that's a consideration that was there from the start, because at the beginning, the EU didn't want to regulate AI. There were best practices codes and very flexible texts that didn't come with sanctions if they were not respected. But now, faced with US and Chinese giants, the EU realized that it couldn't fight back on a technological standpoint. So its answer to that was a legal answer, fighting for fundamental rights. So that the idea was to influence other states to adopt similar regulation and to protect our shared values. That's what we call the Brussels effect. And it's something that you can feel reading the text. It's a risk-based approach. So on the basis of the risks inherent to your AI system, well, you will have to abide by certain regulations. So some will be banned. Others will have to abide by a certain series of obligations, and others will not be imposed obligations to. So what's interesting with this is that parallel to the AI regulation, the EU started working on a directive on accountability, and a few days back, this project was dropped. So it's now on standby, and this idea of not limiting the economy innovation is quite present. About the effectiveness of the law, well, about the AI regulations, we can't tell. It's too early to tell because it hasn't come into force yet. Then there's a question of sanctions. Are they strict enough? Or could big tech say, okay, we'll know that we will face sanctions, so maybe we can set aside a sanctions budget. Then there's the issue of sovereignty of the EU faced with giant companies with that can wield massive economic power. I don't want to be too pessimistic, though. We do have a regulation that's there. Will it be respected now? I don't know. We'll see. Giada Pistilli. Well, very often we hear that these companies do not want to be held responsible. They don't want to abide by these regulations. They say that they limit them. And in Europe, we've noticed that they do not develop their systems in Europe. We are always the last ones to get them. Apple Intelligence, ChatGPT, and we're the last ones to get it because what they tell us that it's a pain to apply all the regulations, but it's just leverage. It's leverage for coercion. That's their way of saying, oh, we have to comply with your regulation, fair enough, but in that case, you will get the new technologies last. So it's almost a form of geopolitical strategy and a way to put pressure on us. There's the Brussels effect, and there's also the cookies effect. An Australian colleague was telling me it's so annoying to use EU websites because you always have to opt out of cookies. It's true, it came from good intentions. We're very lucky. My colleagues working in that field, and my US colleagues keep telling me, you're very lucky having the GDPR. Your data is protected, but the issue is it's made our life a little bit more difficult on a daily basis. So the problem is that we're focusing on the negative aspect of things. Well, the user is being punished. Estelle, Pannatier, we were talking about EU regulation, but the question of AI regulation is brought up in quite a range of international fora now. The UN, NATO, related to military issues, and regularly there are calls for a more an AI that would be more respectful of human rights, that would not increase north-south inequalities, an AI that wouldn't use as much natural resources, because on top of the risks on democracy, there's also risks on the environment. So international law takes a long time to set up. So could we, maybe on the long term, think that there would be a form of international governance to AI? Or would that just be wishful thinking in the current configuration with the major players who are not very eager to go in that direction? For example, the Paris summit, the document was signed by China, but not by the US. Well, that's a very interesting question. International governance is something that people are working on for a number of years already. There is the Council of Europe Convention that was drafted last year. It's the first binding international instrument for states that focuses on fundamental rights, the rule of law, and democracy in AI. That's also what Switzerland is looking into. So there are many initiatives, but they don't lead to much results. What we've seen in the recent Paris summit is this topic of sustainability emerge. And in the Convention of the Council of Europe, that's something that wasn't mentioned much. And there's also the question of innovation, investment in innovation. There are billions invested every day. Almost every day we hear of new investments, very large data centers. That seems to be going against the idea of sustainability, right? Well, absolutely. And the thing is that in that race, bigger seems to be better. So we need to think beyond this opposition, innovation, regulation. The first question maybe we should ask ourselves is, what AI do we want? Well, we'll be coming back to that question, how to create a more ethical AI. Clémentine Pouzet. In Europe, standard setting goes hand in hand with initiatives that come from other sectors, even though it's just at its beginning, right?
Now, there are several aspects to my answer. First of all, some while ago, there was the idea of having a joint convention, but then it was sidelined. The European Union and the Council of Europe started thinking about binding texts around the same period of time, but the European Union takes into account economic interests more than the Council of Europe, so in the end it didn't happen. Then, as far as the negotiations as such are concerned, could you remind us of what the Council of Europe is? Because it's less well known than the EU. Well, the Council of Europe is an institution that was created after the Second World War precisely to bring together countries to protect the rule of law and the fundamental rights. And the European Convention on Human Rights stemmed from it, amongst other things. The Council of Europe actually has more states parties than the European Union. Then, within the European Union, during the negotiations, representatives of companies, but also other entities were invited to take part in the discussions and the debates and endeavor to reach consensus. Yes, And this reminds us of the models of governance of the internet that bring together states, firms, associations, representatives of civil society. It could be a source of inspiration, possibly. Well, why not? But then we would need to see whether it could be effective. But we would be striving for a framework that would be as effective as possible. But you do indeed need multi-party work for that. The firms themselves, the ones that develop AI systems, or at least a part of these ecosystems or a platform, what can they do in terms of ethics? If we're looking at including the respect of human rights and sustainability in the models from the word go, so to speak, how would that happen? Well, first I'll ask you a question, then I'll tell you about my job. The two are actually linked. So what can the firms do in terms of ethics? Well, a lot. Because where the legislation and regulations don't yet exist, it is up to ethics to enter into force. So we have several stages, several phases, and it's important to bear in mind that there are different forms of AI, because you're not going to govern systems of facial recognition and language systems. And when I say there are different phases, it's because if you want an ethical approach, because ethics is what? It's a way of envisaging problems, anticipating them, but also working on how you're going to develop the ethical tool. We've spoken about biases. Representation is a huge issue that concerns data, because without data there is no AI, quite simply put, even though we are starting to talk now about synthetic data, which is data generated by AI systems, but we can come back to that later if you want. And then there's the major question of how is it going to be deployed, because you're not going to have the same ethical issues on a system of conversational AI that has to summarize the diagnoses of patients in a hospital and a chatbot's conversation. So you're just not going to have the same systems for the two. It's just to give you an example. It's a distinction that I always make between development and deployment. They're very different. And then the huge thing that's lacking is data research. I'm very sensitive to this because I used to use it to work on research related to a chatbot. All that to say that we often have in mind what the tool will look like, but we don't really have in mind what their uses will be. ChatGPT can do pretty much everything. The new agents of OpenAI, agents I mean like ChatGPT, but that can do actions on the internet for you, do your shopping, book a ticket, and so on. It's the same thing. We give them huge abilities. So for somebody like me, it's very difficult to work in anticipating and trying to frame all this. Now, what do I do on a daily basis? I'm a researcher above everything else, interdisciplinary research in ethics in AI, and what my main job is multilingualism, and it was actually mentioned in the film that we saw. I look at the way in which English is dominant in these AI systems, and from a philosophical point of view, what are all the value systems that are shared through its responses, its output, and in its exchanges with its final users, and what can the consequences therefore be on society as a whole. And then I also work with AI companions, and the emotional links that people can establish with virtual entities. Now, you're speaking about multilingualism. That's an excellent example. We see how the current LLMs, for example, they are based on a huge body of text that English is going to be dominant in. So how are these biases actually created ultimately? There are other ways of developing AI, aren't there? Well, of course, there are always other ways. And when I spoke about the Far West, the Wild West, it really is the Wild West. Everything you see in the industry and in research is what's being done now. You shouldn't imagine that machine learning, which is what most AI systems are developed on currently, well, it's very new. It's new science, and I don't even know for sure that we can call it a science because it's really test and try. So we are the guinea pigs, so to speak, of all this. But speaking about languages, yes, and this reminds me of the film. We spoke a lot about the definition of freedom of speech. And if you interpret that in the American way, the consequences are of a certain kind, especially if you take into account the background and what is carried by certain words. You have the regulation, then you have the translation that will be done by each country according to their context. If you have one single vision of the world for the entire world, that's going to have a huge impact, and it's not necessarily going to be positive. Estelle, yes, I wanted to react to what you were saying when you said we were all guinea pigs, because I think that's one of the main issues. We realize that we have technologies and systems that are marketed, but they're not ready. There are still risks that they carry and negative consequences, and this is a major issue. If these technologies are not mature enough, what's going to happen? Well, it happens because it's in the interests of the finances of the company that's putting these systems out there. Now, these firms are responsible, but are the users not responsible as well? I'm not speaking about the final users, but the authorities or private firms that are going to start working with these AI tools on a daily basis. And this is interesting because when there was the summit on AI in Paris, there was a counter summit organized by a philosopher, Mr. Sadin, and the Trade Union of Journalists, and they were giving the floor to people from sectors who were impacted by AI, and they said that they got the impression they were being short-circuited and that a ton of activities were being replaced. So are the structures that use AI not responsible as well? Yes, absolutely. Responsibility is shared at all levels, all the way through to the actual use. And then in each sector, things will be different. It's not the same thing to use the system in recruitment and in predictive police, for example. So the context is going to have an impact, and the analysis will differ depending on what sector you're looking at. And you're always going to have to ask yourself who's winning and who's losing with the use of these systems. And then there's the responsibility of the authorities when they set up these systems, from the acquisition itself all the way through to its deployment and to the need for transparency. And this is a major issue.
Clémentine Pouzet, de quelle
Clémentine, how does the regulation, above and beyond the systemic risks that we've already touched upon, the AI Act and facial recognition, how does regulation also take into account, for example, the risks for employment or for the environment? we get the impression that these are not taken into account that much for the time being. Yeah, that's my feeling too. I get the impression that environmental risks are not really taken into account in the AI Act. And in terms of employment, I understand that as meaning job losses. Well, I think what's being said is that, yes, AI is going to lead to people losing their jobs, but it's going to create other jobs. That's all fine, but it is important to have some articles in the AI Act to minimize this impact. And in that sense, employment is not really taken into account, nor is the environment. So there's maybe a gap in terms of perception, depending on whether you're talking about the legislator or the general public. So maybe one last series of comments before we give the floor to the members of the audience. Now, earlier on, Giada, we were talking about the risk of placing the responsibility increasingly on the shoulders of the end user. But what can citizens actually do with regards to these systems? Should we be looking at virtual use of them? And how can we develop a kind of critical approach and also enhance resilience? I'll try to be brief because I also want to hear the audience. First of all, one should not believe those who say that artificial intelligence is too complicated to understand. Everybody can understand it. I studied philosophy and I'm doing coding now, but it's much easier to understand AI than to create your own web page. My husband, who's an engineer, keeps repeating that to me. So what I would say is learn about it. It's not as easy as making cookies, but you can understand it. When people say it's a black box, it's incomprehensible, you could never understand it, well, there's a lot of research going on to try and understand exactly what is happening. And I think that it's important that we try to become familiar with the topic and understand it. In addition, I think that one very positive approach is to decentralize all the power that's currently concentrated in the hands of the IT giants. So we need to be focusing on open source. We should play around with these systems, even try to create our own AI systems and use AI in the most specific way possible, adapt it to your own use. I think the future is less of a general AI, a more frugal, a more contextualized AI. Frugal is a word that's very trendy in France at the moment. And I like this idea. That's even a branch of research that's called optimization. So to summarize, the large systems, large AI systems, it's very difficult to get them to work on our home computers. Optimization run AI systems not on a large graphic card of a gamer's graphic card, but on a much smaller processor that's going to use a lot less energy. It's going to be a lot faster, and it's much smaller. So it's great from all respects, and that's what DeepSeek showed us in China. You can develop a high-performing model that's very small and not costly at all. So and then the last thing is we should be critical. Now, there we could organize an entire conference on that topic, but try to inform yourselves and come to your own conclusions. But I'll stop there, but I just don't think it's a good idea to tell people that it's too complex and impossible to understand. Thank you, Estelle, Pannatier. What can the citizens do and what can be done to avoid a disaster? Well, I think that you should always be aware and informed about what's being said and who's saying it. What we hear a lot at the moment is that AI is going to lead to the end of humanity. It's an existential crisis. There's going to be mass extinction. And then on the other hand, there are those who say that AI will enable us to solve all humanity's problems, that we don't need to worry anymore about poverty, about famine, about climate change, and all the rest of it. And all of these narratives tend to focus on a future that we know very little about, and to forget what's happening right now in the present. And these narratives often are carried, when you look at who is expressing them, by those who are behind the technologies. They say, well, we're setting up the technologies, it's very complex, nobody can understand it, so we're the ones who are going to make the decisions, we're the ones who have to regulate it because it's very complex. And I think that's what's extremely dangerous in a democracy. It's really important that we all take part in this governance and that we get involved. Clémentine Pouzet, well, very briefly, I think there's a lot of awareness raising and education to be done. And as users, end users, we need to be aware of how AI works. I think you've all on the social media started watching videos on the topic. And then
Et ça s'illustre aussi dans le film qu'on a vu, où vous commencez.
similar to what we saw in the film, in the film they were creating a profile and then watching videos, and I think it's a good idea to do that, to remain informed and always keep a critical eye and be aware of what's being said. Thank you very much, and now we'll open the floor so that the members of the audience can ask their questions.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Oui, il y a des...
Are there any questions? Yes, there are hands that are beginning to be raised in the audience.
Merci. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for this panel discussion. It's very interesting.
Peut-être trouver qu'elle est hors sujet.
I have a question. You might find it off topic. If it's the case, just tell me I'm off topic. But maybe a little bit more related to the film. There's something that really eluded me recently, and maybe with all your skills and degrees, you'll be able to enlighten me. It's the situation in Romania, a very concrete situation. How do you interpret it? What happened with the elections? The reason why I'm asking the question is because you were saying that the elections were cancelled, but maybe that raises questions about what democracy is as well. I think it's a very current example of this discussion. Well, I don't feel it's off topic at all. It is a very complex story, though. So, if I'm not mistaken, the first round of the presidential elections in Romania was cancelled because the equivalent of our Constitutional Council considered that the elections were manipulated because of the way one candidate, the far-right candidate, has been pushed virally by social networks, mostly TikTok. I'm not sure about other platforms, but it is a real issue, and it does raise questions on the fragility of our democracies. Clémentine Pouzet, maybe? Well, very quickly, it's very similar to the Cambridge Analytica scandal a few years back. We heard about it during the US elections, but also during the Brexit vote. So that wasn't TikTok, but Facebook, and Facebook user data had been collected, and they've been able to single out undecided users, and then those users were fed pro-Brexit content. So that type of manipulation is not new, unfortunately.
D'accélération ou est-ce
And do you think that type of practices is becoming more common? And then there's also the fact that TikTok is some sort of a black box. We don't really know how it works. It's unlike Facebook back then. Well, those phenomena are difficult to analyze because we very rarely have access to data from these platforms. So things are getting easier at EU level with our regulations, but it's difficult to prove how much it shapes public opinion and how much it influences elections and votes. We carried out research on German elections recently, and we looked at AFD. AFD posts to see if they were promoted more than other posts from other parties. And we realized that AFD posts were promoted a lot more or seen a lot more, but we couldn't quite tell if it was from the algorithm itself or from the support to AFD or from the fact that Elon Musk had promoted AFD himself, which would in turn would have increased the interest in those posts. So we don't have a full view on this situation. And it's actually a call for more research. There's a whole ecosystem that needs to be rethought, a whole global strategy that also includes these platforms and training. Yes, well, I haven't worked on Romania per se, but I've worked on influence a lot, and we know that today it is more difficult to know how many people are affected because there are various amplification phenomena. There are bots. It's also easy to create audience results that do not represent the actual audience. But how does it influence public opinion? That's even more difficult to tell. Of course, there's research ongoing, but that's the most complex aspect of the question. And back then, Meta used to open its data to researchers, but it's not the case anymore, which, well, doesn't make the life of researchers any easier. I hope that answered your question. Microphone for the speaker, please.
Bah, effectivement, c'est toute la question aujourd'hui de la remise en cause de l'état de droit qui est
Well, yeah, it's the whole rule of law that's called into question.
C'est toute la question de savoir quel est le système. Enfin, il faudrait avoir une connaissance un peu plus pointue que ce que j'ai du système politique aussi pour pouvoir savoir.
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in Romanian politics, but I would need to know a lot more to know if it was the right call or not. But it's true that need to take. It's difficult for me to imagine such a situation in Switzerland where we would have to cancel a vote. But maybe that's something we need to think about. Are there any other questions from the floor? Oh, there's several hands raised.
Oui, mais alors du coup, je ne sais pas s'il y a un micro en haut. Oui. Ah bah allez-y.
Merci. J'avais une question plus personnelle pour les panélistes.
I had a personal question for the panelists. I was wondering, in your career or in your research, when did you start looking at AI? What did you do before, and how did you branch out
into AI?
Moi, j'ai fait un master 2
Well, I'll start. I did a master's degree on European law and human rights law. I was very interested in productive justice. And discussing the topic with my thesis director, I started working on AI and an AI framework focusing on gender discrimination and on the way AI could amplify those discriminations. And then I started my thesis, broadening the topic a bit. Well, very quickly, I was studying philosophy, and when I was doing my master's degree, I followed a course on ethics in technology. Back then, in 2016, AI ethics, that wasn't a topic at all that was looked into very much. And I started working on the democratic aspects of AI. Then I started my thesis in France while working in this form of work-study thesis contract. Because I wanted to see firsthand what AI was about. I started working with a company that developed chatbots for territorial administrations, and now I've been working in AI for 3 years. I studied political anthropology and then digital governance, and then what can we do with the data coming from schools in Switzerland? And then we start looking into data that takes you into algorithms and AI, and you have to look at the issues of power behind those technologies. So that was very interesting for me to look at this as from a civil society point of view.
Moi, j'utilise pas mal vos applications dans mon travail et je trouve ça super.
Hello. Now, I use your apps in my work. They're very intuitive, very easy to use. You were saying that AI should be very accessible. Everyone can do AI. My question is about the use of AI with ChatGPT. ChatGPT has hallucinations. So, philosophical question for you. Do we accept to use a tool that provides you false information? Shouldn't that become a problem in the future, especially if users are not aware of these hallucinations? It's a philosophical question. Can we accept the fact that that AI may not be 100% correct? Well, thank you very much for asking that question. Hallucinations, AI hallucinations, are when these models invent facts. And it's difficult to spot because the content tends to be about 90% correct, and then there's small imagined details. So it's based on probabilities, so it calculates what the next word will be. So they can come up with bibliographical references that are completely false, for example. Can we accept it or not? I think not. You're talking about the medical sphere. Well, it's not the same as with ChatGPT. It's much more stringent in the way they use AI. But even if ChatGPT invents a fact or invents something that doesn't exist, there can be a whole cascade of consequences. That's also why AI is not used everywhere. And to give an anecdote, well, in research, that's a very difficult call to make. So, do companies still use AI implement AI? Unfortunately, yes. And that raises the question of critical thinking. And actually, when you're using all those tools, there's always this caveat about the information provided by the model. And also, when you're just looking for information, do you not use those apps for information search? There's a question at the back of the room. Thank you. That was all very interesting. The film as well. I'd like to come back to the title of the debate. AI at the service of society. I would like you to answer this question because the film talks about many things. We've seen incitement to hatred everywhere. And this journalist, she's on her own and she uses AI tools to find people who will then be brought to justice. So maybe that's an example of how AI can be used differently. But what can AI do for us? That's a very good question. Estelle Pannatier. Well, an example that speaks volumes. How can we use AI to tackle discriminations? Those systems are very good to analyze a large amount of data. They're very good at identifying patterns or models of discrimination. We could use them to reduce inequalities in our societies. Unfortunately, today, that's not how they're used. They are used to improve efficiency and to cut costs. So that takes me to the same question always. Why do we want to use those technologies?
Clémentine Pouzet?
C'est vraiment pour réagir à ce
Clémentine Pouzet? Well, I'd like to bounce back on what you've just said, Estelle. If we take a step back, AI has shed light on quite a number of issues that we need to look into. We're talking about discrimination, human rights violations, democracy, the rise of extremism. Being aware of those issues, that can already be something positive coming out of AI. And I lost my train of thought here.
Peut-être parce que je travaille dans ça, mais je crois aux assistants.
Well, maybe it's because I work in that field, but I do believe in personal assistants, and I think they can be really useful for repetitive tasks, for example. But once again, that's because it's my field and I use them on a daily basis. Maybe it's because I know how to use them. So once again, that takes us back to the fact that we need to train ourselves on to using those tools. Now, AI at the service of society at large, well, AI is not always useful. And we are now in a phase where we want to implement AI everywhere all the time. But I think 5-10 years from now, we will start realizing that, oh, well, that wasn't a good idea. Same thing as digitization everywhere. Being told that we're out of time, maybe we can take one last question. The gentleman over there. I wanted to know what you thought about adopting a strict legal framework on AI agents. So these are the agents that could interact with services online as if they were us. For example, I had to create a proxy. That's very complicated for my parents. I had to go physically with my parents to draft the proxy. Could we have something similar for AI agents? Who wants to start? Well, I'm not sure I fully understood what the type of AI you were talking about.
C'est la question de la responsabilité ou la question juste du cadre juridique de manière générale?
Are you talking about accountability or about the legal framework? Well, you just mentioned that. We're talking here about AI agent, AIs that are being developed that can interact with websites for you. For example, they can buy things for you, buy plane tickets for you. I can't use my friend's bank card with his code to buy things on the internet, but AI agents, AI assistants will be able to do that. What will be the legal framework for that? Thank you. Thank you for your question. So for Switzerland, I don't know, but the AI Act is based on risks. There are different levels of risks, so everything that will be banned first. Biometric technologies, of course, there will be some exceptions, and there's high risks. There are a high-risk AI, like recruitment AI or education police AI, and then there are different criteria to be met. If we analyze that, the AI, and it fit within the high-risk category, then the supplier and the company in charge of implementing it would have to comply with a number of obligations. The issue with risks today is that concretely we don't know what they are, and we'll have to go through a standardization process, and the ISO standards are currently being drafted. Thank you. Can we take one very last question? I have a question on the responsibility of companies that make AIs. Because we've always talked about AI as being well-intentioned. Even social networks are supposed to be there for a force for good, but those who make AIs they have bad intentions. For example, China now has an AI that is used to control its population. But what about in the US? Could we have AIs like X's AI that have bad intentions for our democracy? Well, absolutely. Well, the first thing I can say is that there's no well-intentioned AI. Algorithms are not neutral nor objective. It depends who's made them, who is using them. And today it's human beings that are behind the whole this whole business. So our values also translate into technology. It's obvious that technology can be used for good, for crime. A striking example is all those apps that can generate fake content, deep fakes, pornographic deep fakes. I don't see how that would help the common good. And they are criminal applications of AI. Well, what I've learned studying ethics is not because your intentions are good that you're going to do good things. When I first joined Hugging Face, a colleague took ChatGPT and did a chat and plugged it onto 4chan. 4chan is the cesspool of internet, and it generated 4,000 hate messages, and he posted it on a platform. That was then the CEO came down to me and was like, "Okay, how do we manage that?" So that came from a good intention, but there's a documentary on the creator of the YouTube recommendation algorithms who is now not working in this industry anymore, and the same as those who created the emoji and the algorithm for Facebook. and their original intentions that was very positive, and now we see where it took us. One very last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this evening, and thank you for your positions on open source. I'm wondering if we can really talk about open source if the source of the training is not really open source. But then my other question is, can the state, the Genevan state or the Swiss state, organize sessions on this and all the way through education, going from a moratorium to the hosting of open source LLMs and ethical ones. So the transparency of training sources is a true issue. Yes, and you're actually touching the very heart of things. I was worried it might be a little complex, but I'll try and simplify it as much as possible and leave the second part of the question to my colleagues. Yes, there is a real issue here. What is open source in the era of AI? I prefer the term open weight. Weight relates to the neurons. We're not going to enter the technical details, but in research, there is some consensus. In AI, the notion of open source is very vague. There are various definitions, but the most adapted ones are that there are different degrees of openness. We speak more about the openness of architecture, of the weight, and of the user licenses. Meta played around with this for a while. Can you really speak of open source if the license is not open source? And then in terms of the actual data, nobody's open source there, and it's a real mess. Now, the second part of the question, what can the authorities do to promote and assist in developing more virtuous models? Well, the question related to open source and the authorities is not a new one. It goes way back. If you think of Microsoft and other services that we are dependent on, and in Switzerland, we speak increasingly of digital sovereignty. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of investment in systems that we use that don't need to be absolutely massive. We need to think about why we need them and build them accordingly. But that requires political will, and it also means that we're going to need to go beyond the hype that we're currently bathing in, adopt a rational approach, and decide, rather than testing everything, decide what we really need and we need exactly, and work on that basis. And the same goes for the social media. How can we create alternatives where discussions can be held and constructive discussions at that? Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having stayed right to the end. Thank you to the three members of the panel, to the three panelists. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.